Hello and welcome to Policy Beast. On tonight's show, we have Jack Lewis, who is running for the 7th Middlesex State Representative seat, representing Ashland and parts of Framingham. Mr. Lewis, thank you so much for coming back on Policy Beast.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been a long time since we last spoke, and a lot's happened.
That's right. So since we've last sat down together, we went through a primary, and you have emerged victorious on the Democratic side. And now we're down to 3 candidates, of which you are one. So I think maybe the best thing for us to do to get started is to reintroduce you to some of the good people of Ashland. Who is Jack Lewis?
That's a great...
and why is he running for this seat?
Excellent. Yes, it's been an interesting ride over these last 9 months of waking up babies and interrupting dinner. And the reality is we still have a couple more weeks to the general, so I look forward to meeting more folks. So by background, I'm an ordained minister. I've served congregations around the country and around the world. And by profession, I'm somebody who runs a nonprofit that I helped start for at-risk teens. I have a 6-year-old that goes to a local public school, and I feel that background equips me with a unique perspective around the issues that face Ashland and Framingham, and I'm eager to take that background, those commitments to the State House to represent our towns.
So you've got the background and you've got a lot of experience, but why are you running for this seat?
It's a really great question, and it's a question that I probably ask more than any other question as I interrupt dinners or wake up babies. So
canvassing's a lot of fun.
Canvassing
phone calls
is a lot of fun. Is a lot of fun. So, as I think I mentioned to you before, being a minister, working in a congregation, working on social justice issues, working with at-risk teens, to be honest, I was very content living in that world, working with people, working with communities, advocating for communities. It was actually the adoption of our son a couple of years ago through DCF foster care that changed my perspective on a lot of things. I've always been interested in politics. I've interned in government offices. I've been involved in campaigns. But the adoption of our son, being overnight becoming a father and having this ultimate responsibility of another human being, changed my perspective on things, and in a way that I never thought possible, in a way that no parenting book or any class could prepare me for. And I today want to make sure that the world he lives in, the world his classmates live in, the world all of us live in, is one that's safe for him, one that encourages his creativity, one that allows him to thrive, and one ultimately that I'll be happy to give to him and be proud to give to him. And so with that background, with that commitment to my son and his classmates and that generation, I entered this conversation. Back in November and December, I met with elected officials to talk about what I could do to serve the community, and many of them urged me to run. Over the last 9 months, knocking on doors, having conversations with people, what became further apparent are that the issues that have long been important to me and my family, the issues of hardworking class people, are the issues that are important to everyone in our towns. And I want to take that perspective that I have to the State House to advocate every single day, not for any special interest or not for leadership in Boston, but instead for working class families like my own.
Well, speaking of perspectives, Jack, let's just leap right into the issues. So, there was a candidates forum in Ashland a little while ago, and a lot of great issues came up. One of those issues centered around education, in particular Chapter 70. A lot of conversation back and forth about that. If you could clarify some of your viewpoints on that and how that impacts Ashland, and what you would do as a representative to examine this issue and other issues around education.
I think there's nothing that an elected official can do more than to advocate for education for the success of our towns. If I'm fortunate enough to be elected, I look forward to partnering with Senator Karen Spilka to continue to advocate for Ashland and Framingham, specifically around education. Chapter 70 funding has long been an issue, especially in a town like Ashland.
Yes.
Folks in Ashland work really, really hard. They pay a lot in taxes, and we have an obligation to also make sure that our children are supported in their schools. We're all here today because a previous generation decided that we were worthy. We were worthy of a quality education, and we are required to make sure that our children are provided at least that much, that our children are provided opportunities to reach their fullest potential like we were provided. So when it comes to Chapter 70, I look forward to continuing Representative Thomas Anicando's legacy of advocating for Ashland, bringing home money every chance I get, and continuing to partner with Karen Spilka to force the conversation around equitable funding of our schools, making sure that Ashland and Framingham get their fair share back of state funding.
Well, speaking of fair share and state budgets and all such, I know that's in general, that's something that our representatives have to deal with all the time at Beacon Hill. You know, we had a little conversation before we went on camera, and we were talking a little bit about some of your, well, philosophical stances on state budgets and how we can better deliver services with some of the constraints that we have. I was wondering if we'd want to talk a little bit about that, because I think that would be interesting for folks to hear about.
So I'm committed to continuing Tom's fight to make sure that our state budget isn't balanced on the backs of those who most need our support. The budget needs to be balanced, and we need to have difficult conversations about spending. But we can't cut services to seniors. We can't cut education spending. We can't cut funding for programs for people with disabilities to balance the budget. We need to think creatively, and we can't continue to cut services that seniors, people with disabilities, children, depend on. And so my hope would be to continue to advocate in the way that Tom has, to use the political capital that I'm going to go to Boston with to advocate for working poor families, hardworking middle-class families, families that pay their fair share in taxes, who deserve to have quality education for their children, seniors who have worked their entire lives, paid more than their fair share in taxes, and now that they've retired, they deserve to know that the community that they have long supported also supports them. And so the state budget is a complicated animal. We need to look at it with a scalpel and not an axe, but we can't balance it based on the backs of those who most need our support. We need to have creative conversations about revenue. We need to have creative conversations about where our commitments are. And for me, all of these conversations need to get back to our values. What are our values as a culture? What are our values as a community? What and who do we value? And our state budget, I think, is the ultimate example, ultimate product of our values.
Well, I'm going to push back on you a little bit, because you know, and it's interesting how you've stated that, you know, how the state budget is kind of a manifestation of what we as a society hold important. And I think many would agree with you on that. But some might say, well, you know, Jack, you know, hard times are all over, and nobody likes the idea of taking money away from seniors or kids or those who need it the most. But, you know, how are we going to get ourselves into a more fiscally responsible space if we don't make cuts all the way around the board? Why? Well, you know, everybody's got to feel a little bit of the pain, you know, in order for us to get our ship steered correctly. What would you say to folks who will say that? Because they will say that on Beacon Hill.
Oh, of course, a couple things. So I think there are already those who are feeling their fair share of the pain. And so when we talk about this equitable cut so that everyone feels a little bit more of the burden, that's ignoring the fact that there are already those who are feeling a great deal of the burden. There's this imagery that a rising tide lifts all boats. But the reality is that if you're not in a boat, you drown. And if you're in a boat that has a hole in it and no one's providing you the opportunity to patch the hole, no one's helping you with your hole, you're going to drown as well. And so we need to have a conversation about where our priorities are and let the budget be an example of that.
So what are some of the specific programs that you are particularly concerned about that you wouldn't want to see cuts to, or do you want to see improvements to reflect those values in our budget?
So one in particular is programs for people with disabilities. I know this last budgeting process, there were several amendments offered after the fact. A lot of them were passed and put back into the budget. But the idea that a budget was put forth that cut essential services to people with disabilities is more than concerning. It's embarrassing. So the Turning 22 program being a core component of this, children and youth who are supported their entire lives, that transition from adolescence to adulthood, the funding needs to be there to help them with that transition. We can't balance the budget by cutting services like that.
So when the Turning 22 program, I don't know if everyone's familiar with that. So it helps these kids. How specifically does it assist
So
these kids?
there's state funding and services available for youth up to a certain age. And then as they turn 22, things get more complicated. And so funding to ensure that that transition happens from the support they often get at home and in schools to the support that people may need for the rest of their adult lives. And so Turning 22 being that stepping stone program into what the rest of their lives would be like. But education's a huge piece of this as well. There are 16,000 children on wait lists in Massachusetts for pre-K. 16,000 kids that can't wait 3 years for pre-K services. In 3 years, they're going to be in the third grade. Right. We have other conversations about wait lists, but there are 16,000 kids today that are going to start kindergarten or, depending on the town, maybe even first grade, at a greater disadvantage than their classmates. And that disadvantage is going to stay with them for many years through their education system. Every dollar we invest in these youth in pre-K today will bring back greater results for them and for society 2, 3, 4-fold. And so these are just a couple small examples, but I think the state budget, as I said before, needs to be reflected as in an outgrowth of our values, and we need to look at every single line and reflect on who we are as residents of Ashland and Framingham, who we are as residents of this wonderful Commonwealth that has long led the way on every issue, from the Revolutionary War to the abolition of slavery, from marriage equality to movements towards universal health care. We can't let up on that gas pedal of progress, and if we do, other states will take better care of their citizens. And the idea that their residents, the idea that residents in New York or California somehow work harder and deserve to make a higher minimum wage than residents in Framingham and Ashland and the greater Commonwealth just doesn't make sense to me. And so if I'm fortunate enough to be elected this November, I'm pledging to continue Tom's legacy of advocating for people who don't often have a voice in halls of power, but also working class families like my own that understand that budgets aren't just something that happens at a state level. Budgets are something that our families also have to worry about day in and day out. And they're complicated, but even our family budgets are an example of what's essential and what our values are.
True. Getting back to some of the specific policy issues underneath the budgeting issue, we talked a lot about youth. I think you did mention seniors. You know, there are a lot of concerns. You know, how can we better support our seniors up at Beacon Hill, make sure that they get their fair share of services as well? Sometimes we do concentrate on young people so much, but I remember you have spoken on this quite a bit as well, and I just wanted to get some clarification on your views on that.
So real estate taxes being something that seniors who have worked really hard to pay off their home, and they're proud to live in a community, they're proud to be able to walk to Sunnyside, they're happy to be able to go to the library. If they're fortunate, they're still funding for continuing education classes, but they still have this home. And so I think we as a Commonwealth and we as a community have to continually reflect on what real estate tax burden does to seniors who are now on a fixed income. I think we have to have more conversations on the other end of the spectrum as well for the working poor and what the reality of living in our communities means for them as well. But people who are also on fixed incomes.
Well, I was going to say, you know, being a senior and being working poor, that's not necessarily mutually exclusive either.
Of course, yes.
So, I'm sorry.
No, you're right. And it's seniors who are now going back to the workforce after being retired, who are getting jobs, who are now making minimum wage in a way that they've maybe never made minimum wage in the last several decades. And it just doesn't add up. And so they're looking at their budgets, they're trying to make ends meet, and they've worked really hard to be able to purchase and live in a town, purchase a home in a town where they want to retire, they want to spend their golden years, and they need somebody who's going to advocate for them. And maybe that means not maybe, what it means is we need to have regular and constant conversations about what our tax policies mean to seniors, what real estate tax policies mean to seniors. We just simply need to do more. And if I'm fortunate enough to be elected, one of the things I pledge to do is to be as accessible as possible, to hold more office hours than any other state rep could imagine holding, so that seniors and working poor and the overlap of those two communities and everyone else in between can hold me accountable. Because I'm going to go to the State House and advocate for our communities. But I'm going to need everybody through the course of this election, but also post-election, to hold me accountable, to regularly remind me of their daily experiences. And that's what I hope people will continue to do.
We talked about seniors and the working poor, but we haven't really touched on the middle class.
Yes.
And, you know, there are a lot of folks, hardworking middle-class families here in this town who maybe, you know, they turn on the TV and they read the newspaper and they're like, wow, you know, they're talking about very young people, or they're talking about seniors, or they're talking about working poor, you're talking about all these groups. Whereas middle-class families feel like they're kind of you know, fighting a rising tide. It's harder and harder to keep in place. It's harder and harder to enjoy the same quality of life that you would have expected a middle-class family to have, you know, 10, 20, 30 years ago. There's a real perception that, and there's that the middle class is in danger, not just in Massachusetts, but, you know, nationwide. What are some of the policy issues that concern you in helping the middle class, not just helping folks to stay in the middle class, but helping to also making sure that, you know, there's a path to the middle class for folks as well? What are some of your stances on that?
And I think you're 100% right, and I appreciate the reminder. I think the middle class is often forgotten. Our structure is set up where people who are very affluent, people with connections, they have representation, they have lobbyists. And we do spend time advocating for people who are on the other end of the spectrum, because these are people who most need support, who most need to have their voices brought into halls of power. But the middle class has been forgotten, and I think that can't continue to happen. I was raised in a middle class family. My dad had a union job that made sure that my family was able to buy a house. They were able to save up to send me to college. My mom's a preschool teacher by career. And so middle class through and through. It's the family I come from. It's the family I'm raising. And there are middle class issues that are unique to the middle class. You have to save up for college because you aren't able to be guaranteed financial aid to to the extent that maybe others may be able to. You're working longer hours. You may be working more jobs than you ever imagined you need to work in order to continue to be in middle class status. While at the same time, everything from rent to mortgages is going up. Gas prices may fluctuate, but food prices keep going up.
And wages seem to be flat.
Wages are flat, child care prices are going up, preschool prices are going
Yes.
up, college prices are going up, and in towns like Ashland where there isn't all-day tuition-free kindergarten, you know, we can talk about, and I hope we do talk about taxes later, but taxes are a big piece of this, but fees, and fees that we don't see as additional quasi-taxes, are there, and for me, non-tuition-free kindergarten for working class families is an additional fee or an additional tax that families are burdened with. So what I can say to you is what I'm saying to everyone else, is that when I talk about middle class families, I'm talking about the family I was raised in, and I'm talking about my own family. And these are the families that I'm going to spend a lot of my time advocating for. We need tax policies that are fair to these families. We need structures in place that help people to go from the lower end of the economic spectrum into middle class. There needs to be solid pathways. Education is one of these, which is why I spend a lot of time talking about the waiting lists for pre-K. I spend a lot of time talking about all-day kindergarten possibilities, because education is the pathway for many people from struggling economically to the middle-class life that many of us, fortunately, are able to enjoy. But that's not a guarantee. And rarely a day goes by where I talk to somebody who wasn't recently laid off from their job, somebody who has worked really, really hard in a company for 20 or 30 years. The company is downsized, and now that person who is accustomed to living a middle-class lifestyle, who is in the process of paying college for their kids, trying desperately to provide opportunities for their children that their parents provided for them, are now struggling and unsure how to continue to live in a system that seems to be forgetting about them every single day.
Let's loop back to our resources discussion that
Taxes,
we're having here.
yes.
Let's talk about taxes. One issue that is, I think, first and foremost on a lot of people's minds is this millionaire's tax concept. And I'm wondering what your stance is on that, and if you could maybe expand on that a little bit and talk about how that may fit in with your overall philosophy about budgeting in general.
And I know it's not common for people running for elected office to want to talk about taxes. I think it's unfortunate.
I was about to say, Jack, because you're like, let's talk about taxes.
Talk about taxes.
I'm like,
No.
okay.
No, let's do it.
We can. I mean, I have no
that's fine.
problems with that.
No, but I think it's unfortunate because when elected officials don't talk about taxes, that means the status quo continues. And the status quo in a place like Massachusetts means that people who are on the upper end of the economic spectrum, people who make over $1 million a year, have tax perks that exist for them. The current tax system hurts middle-class families, the forgotten middle-class families we talked about just a moment ago. So
How so?
Yes, and this is why I regularly talk about taxes. I never shy away from an opportunity to talk about taxes.
Well,
so,
they are a certainty in
yes,
life.
we all pay taxes, and so I think, and this connects to the state budget, so we'll get there too. So Massachusetts has a flat tax. It's a little over 5%. So incomes that your income, my income, all of our incomes is taxed at 5%, just a little over 5%.
Little over 5%, yeah.
So it's what's called a flat tax. The great majority of states, I think 42, 43 states, do not have a flat tax. They have what's called a tiered tax system.
It's more reflective of the federal system.
Yes,
Yeah.
where the more you make, the higher percentage you pay back. Massachusetts, I think along with maybe 7 other states, has a flat tax system, so that if a family makes $50,000 a year, they pay 5% of that, and if you make $5 million a year, you pay 5%. The reality, though, is that that's not a proportionate burden. That if you make $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, 5% of your income has a very different effect on your life than if you make $5 million a year and pay 5%.
Yeah, but if you're paying a flat tax, then everybody pays the same. Like if I'm paying more, and I'm paying more money. If I'm making $1 million a year, I'm paying more money than you are if you're making $5,000 a year.
But we're also forgetting other local taxes. So we pay real estate taxes, we pay sales tax, and we pay income tax. And so the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center reflected on all of those taxes, all of our state and local taxes. We're ignoring federal taxes, but they took all those taxes into consideration because we can't think of just one tax in isolation. We have to think of all the taxes we pay. What we're doing now is we're excluding fees, we're excluding water bills, we're excluding paying for the $4,000 for all-day kindergarten. We're excluding that. We're just talking about local and state taxes, mostly real estate, sales, and income tax. And when we do that, the reality is that working class families that make under $250,000 a year, so we're talking about not just solidly middle-class families, but upper middle-class families as well.
Yeah.
If you make under $250,000 a year, you pay about 9% of your income in taxes to either the state or local level, 9%. So we can talk about the 5% flat tax for income, but when you factor in the average person's sales tax and real estate tax, the reality is that if you make under $250,000, you pay 9% in state and local taxes. If you make over $750,000, so now we're...
Well, okay, so yeah, on the flip side, what
On the flip
happens
side,
then?
so what the reality is, if you make over $750,000, you pay 6% because sales tax is regressive and real estate taxes to some extent are as well. So when you take all those into consideration, even if you buy the argument, which I don't buy, that a flat tax isn't regressive, if you take all the taxes we pay to the state and local level, people who make over $750,000 a year pay 3% less of their income back to the state and local government. It's middle-class, hardworking families that are paying 3% more than individuals who make over $750,000 a year. So the fair share amendment or the millionaire's tax or the insertion of a second tier, however you want to talk about it, something that I think
on another show I said, it's kind of, the nomenclature is all marketing to me. It's the mechanism that I find interesting, so go ahead.
So currently we all pay a little over 5%. What this would do, it would add an additional 4% income tax on incomes over $1 million. So incomes up to $1 million, you still pay the 5% flat tax. If you make $2 million, for example, the first million is taxed at 5%. The second million is taxed at 5 plus 4, so 9%. What this would do would bring greater equity to what the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center shows us is greatly imbalanced. It would bring greater equity, bringing that number down, that 6% number I said, that people who make over $750,000 a year pay in taxes, it would bring that number closer to what the average middle-class family is paying. The reality, in my opinion, is that people in Ashland in particular are already paying their fair share in real estate taxes. They're already working really, really hard and paying back in income taxes. We have a sales tax that's regressive that requires that no matter where you fall on the economic spectrum, you have to pay the same percentage to buy goods that we need. People are paying enough. Water bills are high enough. What this does is asks those who make a whole lot more than any of us to pay their fair share back into the system so that the state budget doesn't have to cut essential services to seniors, doesn't have to cut essential services to children and youth. Families, when they look at their budget, they know if they need to pay for something or they want to pay for something, they either need to cut something or add a revenue stream. Many families today, parents are taking out a second job because they know that if they want their kids to go to college, they have to fill that gap because no one's going to fill it for them. The state budget's the same way. We can't think of the state budget as maybe a global corporation like Coca-Cola would think of their budget. Coca-Cola can try a product out, and if that product fails or it doesn't deliver, they can cut that, and the world continues to spin. The state budget's not that way. Funding to programs like DCF, funding to programs like education, support for seniors, support for people with disabilities, these aren't enterprises that are going to bring profit back into the system. And if we think of the budget in that same way, we're going to do a disservice to people who most need our services. So yes, I like talking about taxes because I think that middle-class families are getting shafted in the current system. We need to advocate more for those families and ask people who make over $1 million to pay their fair share in taxes. And I'm not making up the numbers. As I said before, the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center has looked at the numbers, they've looked at other states, and this is the reality we currently face in Massachusetts.
Well, in our remaining few minutes, Jack, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about the race itself. And particularly, you live in Framingham. And those of us in Ashland are wondering, how are you going to represent Framingham and Ashland? Are you going to be able to represent the people of Ashland and their interests as fully as the people of Framingham? And I'm sure you're going to say yes, but but we want a little bit more behind that. What are some of your views around that particular argument that some folks are making about your candidacy?
And it's a great question, and it's one I look forward to continuing to answer. Our district is split between Framingham and Ashland. Our towns are both wonderful towns that are interconnected. The reality is I spend a lot of time in Ashland. I cross the border nearly every day. And there's no fence, there's no border security. The reality is the majority of Ashland and Framingham residents cross between our towns without fully realizing it. Folks in Framingham regularly go down to Ashland to go to Sunnyside or Bodacious Bagels, to walk their dogs at Ashland Ashland Town Forest or Ashland State Park. And folks from Ashland regularly come to or through Framingham to work, to go through Framingham to get to work, to get wine sales at Trader Joe's, maybe to go to university at FSU.
Or run through Framingham like I like to do.
Or to run through Framingham. The reality is our towns are interconnected, and we have a long history of having representation that lives in both towns. I'm committed to being a representative for both Ashland and Framingham, and that means holding very regular office hours in Ashland. It means spending as much time as possible in this town to hear from folks so that folks can hold me accountable. My family is like many families in both Ashland and Framingham. Our towns aren't radically different. I'm going to advocate like Tom has advocated for both towns. Karen, as state rep before Tom, has advocated for both towns. And the state reps before them. I love Ashland. I love Framingham. I've enjoyed the time I've spent here interacting with people. It's become my second home to some extent. And like most residents of both towns, I see them as interconnected, and I will advocate for Ashland's interests in the same way that I'll advocate for Framingham's interests and bring home funds from the state to the best extent that I can.
And I think we're going to have to leave it there, Jack.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for
Of
joining
course.
us this evening. And thank you for joining us here on Policy Beats. Please remember that Election Day is...
November 8th.
So, and the last day to register to vote in Massachusetts, I believe, is October 19th. Please check with Town Hall to find out more about voter registration and early voting this year as well. Again, Jack Patrick Lewis, running for the 7th Middlesex seat, representative seat in Massachusetts. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you very much